Start recording. So this should be recorded now, hopefully, if I did all of the steps correct. So I will move this link into the Chapter 2 folder if there is a link there. I haven't been able to the past two because I didn't actually record them, so there wasn't anything to move. So let's hope that I did it correct this time. So, okay. The information, the PowerPoint that I'm going to go over today, and the assignments are available on Blackboard. So if you did want to go over to Blackboard, 1 second. Course content, Chapter 2, the lecture, and the assignments I have listed on there. So if you do want to follow along. Yes?
Under technology, we have a course policy validation that is like.
Oh, you don't have to worry about that. Because your classes are combined. So let me come up here so they can hear me. The only people who do have to do that course policy validation quiz is if you have not attended class. If you're just online, so those students that haven't come and are just doing it remotely watching, then they're the only ones that have to complete that. It's their attendance. So you don't have to do it every time, you just have to do it one time, because we do have a drop for non-attendance within the first week of class, which is actually 11 days or so. So if you don't attend any of your classes, you haven't checked in anything like that, then your instructors will mark you as non-attending and then they'll drop you. So you have to show that you have shown up somehow. So that's how it's, if you do that, then that shows me your attendance for this class. Especially since my recordings have exactly the wordings. I can't look at the recording because they can't see that it actually works. So, okay, today we're going to go over Chapter 2. The assignments that we have that do go along with Chapter 2, again, they're listed on the schedule and they're going to be due on Sunday. So you're able to do them after class here, but you will have the week to do them. I'm going to point out just a few things as I go through this that you'll want to note when you do take it's an exercise assignment and the little quiz that's after this, just so you kind of know what it's looking for. Again, with this, just like I did the last chapter, I've included a little bit extra information than what the book actually has, just to kind of clarify some of this. So the first thing I'm going to go over is a review to see what you remember. What does ICD-10-CN stand for?
International Classification of Diseases, Volume 10, clinically modified, or clinically modified?
Clinical modification. Yeah, very close. International Classification of Diseases, Volume 10, blah, blah, blah. So that's why we don't want to say ICD-10-CN. But I did want to make sure that you did remember that, because that's what we're reviewing this entire class. Mortality. What is mortality?
The rate or frequency of death.
Rate or frequency of death. Morbidity.
The rate or frequency of disease.
Rate or frequency of disease. All right. Those are going to come up probably later on. I said probably. Those are going to come up later on, so I just kind of wanted to clarify those. Because sometimes I get them confused in my head, so when I get confused, and I want to remember that, or make sure that you guys all remember, so that we remember. So. Okay, the next. So the book format. So I talked about the book, the ICD-10 code book. I do have a couple copies of those here today. Probably just pass these out so you guys can kind of glance at them. Again, we're gonna go over a little bit of this today because I kind of want you to start looking to see where things are. I do have 3 2017s. Again, you're still going to be able to do what you need to do with the older versions. There's just going to be a few things because when they do update the book, there's a few notes that you'll need, but for today, these are completely fine. And then when we get to the point that we're actually going to use these, then I'll show you the updates. So that way as you're going through the codes, you'll have them. So I'm just going to kind of just pass this one back here for you guys to share on this row. Let's see, I need one more. Share. I've got one. You have one, and then I'll put the other one over here. So I'm gonna have you guys kind of glance at a couple of things.
And it's heavy.
It is heavy. I know, I got this nice little bag. This was my anniversary present. I was like, I need a big bag to carry all my books in, and I need a bigger bag. Okay, so the book that I just passed around, the code book, there's 2 parts to this code book. So this is going to become important when we start looking up the actual codes. So there's 2 parts to the book. The first one is the index, and the second one is the tabular list. So when I say these terms later on, you want to make sure index, tabular list. They're in that order. Your index is at the front of the book. The tabular is at the back of the book. The tabular is the majority of the book. It is 21 chapters, and that's where your actual codes are found. It's going to be in this tabular in these 21 chapters. Mine is color coded. I don't know if yours is color coded or not. I think
Yes, they are.
most of them, okay. Most of the books, again, if you purchase your own, are going to come with a nice little tab sheet at the front, so you can tab, kind of help yourself organize a little bit easier. If you want to put little tabs to indicate your different indexes where the different tables and things are, and maybe if there's a couple of chapters that you're going to be referencing frequently. I actually haven't counted these, but I think that there should be enough where you could actually reference each chapter. So you could put a little tab on there to make it easier to flip back and forth. That's why I said the spiral one, I feel like probably would be easier than this one, because you can actually like open the book up and get it to where you need to go. So if you haven't purchased a book, go with whichever one's the cheapest. But if you can get the spiral one, I feel like the spiral one's probably a little bit easier.
Yeah, the spiral one just doesn't have, the tabs.
It doesn't have the tabs. You can purchase these tabs pretty cheap, these little like Post-it note tab things. If you guys remind me, I probably have a tab in my office and I'll just bring them. And we can put them out and you can tab out your books, so that way it's easier to find things. So within the book, like I said, there's the index and the tabular. The index is divided up into, I guess, four different areas. The first one is the index to diseases and injuries, and that is the main area. And we're going to practice this here in a minute. But when you read through a patient record, the first thing you're going to do is identify a term, and you're going to look that up in primarily the index to disease and injuries. The second part of the other items that are in the index to disease and injuries deal with the table of neoplasms and the table of drugs and chemicals. And so depending on if that is something that you're referencing, the neoplasm or drugs and chemicals, then you may not exactly go to the disease and injuries first. You may go to one of those tables first. But there's always there's a notation that we'll talk about next chapter that will, if you go to the wrong place, direct you to the correct place. The book is pretty much all the information that I'm talking about, these coding guidelines, conventions, even the definition of this information is all found in this code book. So if you look at, I believe it's under the official coding guidelines, the very first page, it actually goes over most of this information. So if you ever, outside of this class, or you're trying to remember some of the information, if you have a code book or if you have the PDF files, everything is available within this code book. All the rules that you need are going to be available in the code book. The second part of the index is the index to external causes of injuries. So that is at the very end, I guess, of the index section. My book, the index is a black, and the index to disease and injuries is black, and the index to external causes of injuries is gray. So they're very similar, and I'll talk about, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but I'll talk about what's in the external causes of injuries and indexes on that. And then, like I said, the tabular list is the majority of the book, and it is divided up into 21 chapters. In the index to disease and injury, so the main part, the bigger index that's at the front of the book, it is an alphabetical list of main terms and codes. So again, you read a record and you are identifying the main term, and then that is what you're going to look up in that index. All of the main terms, if you look in the book, so if you just pull up and look at the index, you're going to see some terms are bold-faced, and then there's some that are indented on various levels. The main terms are always going to be listed in bold-faced. So if you're going to look up diabetes, you're going to look for the bolded diabetes. It's always going to be, and that the main term is always going to be bolded. This is important if you are looking up through the PDF file. Like I said before, you could type in diabetes, and then it pulls up a ton of different diabetes. You're not on the main term that you need to start with until you find that bolded one. So if you look up diabetes and it pulls up something that is indented, you're not on the main term. So if you use the PDF, It is also really important. The book is a little easier to identify if it is the main term or not, because you can kind of flip around, but when you're using the PDFs, you just want to look for the one that is bolded. Your subterms and your qualifiers are going to be indented below that main term. So if we're going to say, for example, something about diabetes, you want to say type 1, type 2, diabetes, for instance, those are going to be indented under that main term. If you look at the next one, I kind of broke that down, and I'll come back to that. So the main term, like I said, printed, boldface, that's going to be the one that you want to look for initially, and then you're going to look for the subterms and the qualifying terms under that. For your subterms and your additional qualifiers, again, be mindful of what level of qualifier you're on. The PDF, I think, does a little bit better of a job on this. If you do look at an example of the PDF, they have different indentions for the level that it's at. So it makes it easier if you're following down. You can see, okay, diabetes with is the first one, and then all of these are going to be that second qualifier. The book, my book, again, they're all just a tad different, has these handy little gray lines that run down the columns. So you want to make sure that you pay attention to those, that you're on the right level. So if you're looking for diabetes with something or type 2 diabetes, you want to make sure that you're on the right line, because some of the times it's going to be repetitive words. So maybe it's with, you can't be with type 2, but it's, I'm trying to think of an example, I should have done that. So maybe it's diabetes with foot ulcer, or diabetes with complications with a foot ulcer. So you want to make sure that you find you're at all of those correct levels. So that's why the little indentions on the PDF are important, and it's important to follow this, because then you could get offline and then you're going to reference the wrong code. So you do want to pay attention to the different levels when you are looking at your main terms and your sub-qualifiers, or sorry, your qualifiers, essential modifiers. Talked about the tables already. When we talk again about the, I want everybody to do this actually, so find the term diabetes, either the PDF or in the books that are provided. If you're going to use the PDF, you're going to want to go over to Blackboard, under Course Resources. At the very top is the index. So this is the index, the index to disease and injuries that you're going to want to look at. So I want you to find, whichever way, find the term diabetes. And I did actually have to put a note on mine, so I knew exactly where it was in the different. Has anybody found the term? My book, it's on page 94. The PDF file is on page 383. So you're doing
Did you ask if we found it in the book?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. You're like, been there, done this. So just so you have a visual of this. So if you find the term diabetes, is it bolded?
Yes.
Okay, so you want to make sure, again, we're looking for the main term. It does need to be bolded. What would be the essential modifiers next to this term? Your non-essential modifiers are codes that are in parentheses next to a main term, but they actually do not have to be in the documented patient file.
Mellitus and sugar.
Mellitus and sugar, those are the non-essential modifiers. So again, if you're looking at a patient record, they could just say diabetes with type 2 diabetes with complications. If it doesn't specifically say sugar, that's fine. It doesn't have to. But if it says sugar, then that's okay. Those don't make a difference. The ones that are in parentheses there, they don't have to be included for you to go to that code. Your subterms, those are essential. So for us to go down to some of these other items, they do have to be documented in that patient file. So you can't choose to go to, let's pick one, diabetes with circulatory complications. If it doesn't say that specifically, you can't go to that. That's not going to be the right code. Your subterms are essential. So to be able to go down to that next level in the book, it does have to be specifically listed in the patient file. Yeah, you can see diabetes. I think it's like 1, 2. There's a lot.
And I was like, I feel bad because I drank this. And I'm like, okay.
But if you do look, it's kind of like basic, so I was trying to find something that has a lot with it. If you don't find the bolded item within there, it does repeat it on each page. If you don't find the bolded item, it's going to be really hard to know where to start. PDF was on page 383. 383. 383. So. It should be searchable, but I guess it's on the website. I think you have to download it for it to be searchable. So say that up here. You can use the search feature in the PDFs that are available, but you do need to download it. I think if you look in the web version, it doesn't give you the option to click and type. So if you wanted to go advance to a certain page or search a specific term, you'll have to download that. They're big files, so I would recommend putting it on PDFs. So they're not that big, they're just a lot of pages. Putting it on your drive, like your student account or something, so that way you don't take up too much room on your personal computer or a flash drive or something like that. So if we're still looking at diabetes, what are some of the essential modifiers or subterms that you see?
Mononeuropathy.
Mononeuropathy.
You name it.
Hepatogenesis.
Where is, okay, so find the subterm type 1. So if we're saying diabetes type 1, so let's say type 1 diabetes with renal complications. What does it show next to that?
You said type 1. Type 1.
Type 1 diabetes with renal complications.
NECE1.29.
Yep. We'll talk about NEC. That's going to be next week. Or I guess not next week, Thursday. We're going to talk about some of those essential terms. So do you guys see where maybe it says renal complication anywhere else? I'm sure I saw this somewhere else.
NECE11.2.
Look on the previous page. If you were to look up diabetes due to drug or chemical with renal complications. See how just because it says that with renal complications, it does change the code there. So that's why it's important to make sure every term that you're looking up is included in that record and that you follow the, chapter 2, we're just kind of talking a little bit about the book. Chapter 3, we're going to talk about some of the additional guidelines that deals with the terminology, like when it's NEC with also different excludes one. We're going to talk about some of those specific terms that you may see. Chapter 5, we're actually going to go over the coding guidelines, and then, chapter 5. And then chapter 4, we're going to go through and practice all of these before we actually break down into the specifics of each chapter. So that way you understand how to determine what is a main term and an essential modifier. So that will be, I'm going to have us practice that quite a bit. So that way it makes a little bit more sense. This chapter is really just kind of talking a little bit more about the book, but I wanted you to look at it and be a little bit more familiar with it. So this was a screenshot of the PDF file. So again, you can see if we were looking for diabetes with, we want to find type 1. So your type 1 and your with are on the same level. So you want to go type 1 and then look under that with if you were looking for type 1 diabetes with complication. not just diabetes with complications.
So just in my understanding of the PDF, when you say type 1 and you point to that column, does that mean the left-hand column is not applicable to type 1 necessarily? Is
Yes,
that correct?
That is correct. So if I had wrote out, do you have a marker? Diabetes, say it says with complications. And then if I have type 1, complications. So just looking at these two screens, what would the code be for diabetes with complications?
E11.8.
E11.8. Because we're wanting to look at diabetes with on that first level, then complications. If we're looking at type 1 diabetes with complications,
E108.
Yeah, okay.
B1, yeah. So that's when you're going to want to look over here. It does look a little different on the PDF because I couldn't put the whole page on here. So I was trying to pull just snippets of that. And again, when we get to where you're going to practice this, we're going to talk about pulling out the main terms when we're looking, because it's not always going to be like this one. What's your main term? You got your diabetes. This one, what's your main term? Even though type 1's listed here first, that doesn't necessarily mean it is your main term. So you want to identify your main term.
You would have to know to go to diabetes first, then seek out the type 1 and all that.
Yeah, so in chapter, before we get into all of our tabular chapters and the specifics of it, we're going to practice what is our main term, what's our first modifier, our second modifier, so that way when you look at a patient record, you'll know which ones to, so this is your main, and then you go with this one, and then you'll go this one. Does that make sense?
It does, thank you.
It'll make a little more sense when you start practicing it and actually doing it. So these first two chapters is just a lot of information. And then we're going to put it into practice. And then once we get into the chapters, the main thing is just identifying these differences between those chapters and these specific guidelines for those chapters. But once you get the process of looking it up and where to find, is this, a special case or what notation am I looking at, then the process becomes really repetitive on how you look it up. So, I mentioned within the index, there's also a neoplasm table and a drugs and chemical table. These also are broken down in Blackboard. So if you wanted to look at these specifically in Blackboard, go back to your course resources, and we have your neoplasm table and your drug and chemical table. So these are all available here. We do talk about these a little because these are specific chapters as well. So we will talk about these. Current slide. More later on in the semester. So neoplasms is actually the second chapter within your code book, chapter 7 in our book, our textbook. So we're going to review that a little bit more. But pretty much neoplasms, if you see cancer, something that is associated with cancer, generally that's going to be found in the neoplasm table. It just kind of changes the process of looking up a little bit. You're always going to start with the index, but it's which index do you start with? You start with your neoplasms, the drug and chemicals, or you start with the index to disease or the index to, the external causes of injuries index. So just kind of know that there's differences in there, but we'll talk about the specifics of when you use those. Same thing with the drugs and chemicals. So if you see something about a specific drug dealing with poisoning, complications, different things, that you'll refer to the index, within the index, that drug and chemical table. And we'll talk about that more later, like closer to the end of the semester. It's reviewed in chapter 24. And then the index to external causes of diseases, that's that second smaller index. We're going to review this more in chapter 25. The codes in this index are secondary codes. So if you see something like a fall on ice or bitten by a bug or something like that, generally those are going to be referenced in your index to cause of disease. Or it might be, because it's crazy, some of the things that are actually indexed in here. If something happens on a military base or in a barn, there's a specific code that goes along with that if it's documented. So that's the external causes of diseases generally are going to be where you bring in that additional information. Yeah.
Did you read the story about the woman from Missouri that thought she had water in her ear? Went to the doctor.
What is this something gross?
It was a brown recluse.
Oh.
They tried to flush it, and then they,
How do you get that out?
well, they got it out in one piece, and it didn't matter. But I was like, no.
No, thank you.
She said she went to the store afterwards and bought earplugs. And she'll never.
That's gross to think about, though. I mean, I guess they say you swallow like 8 spiders. Like, so I guess it could go in your ear. Because maybe most of them come out, but that's gross. I have a friend that's a
Yeah,
EMT.
I was thinking, how do you code that?
I'm sure there's a
I'm
code
sure
for
that-
everything. Like, I've looked at, well, this book is huge. There should be a code for everything. But I've looked at some random things before, like the external causes of injuries. That one is, I say it's fun, but when you read some of the things that are in here, it became a code because it probably happened more than once. Otherwise, I would imagine it's not a code yet. So some of the things that are in here, I'm like, that became a code. Like this has happened a few times. But like say you got into a car accident and you were the passenger and this injury happened, like there's a code that specifies all that information. So it's kind of interesting. It's kind of, coding is kind of like a puzzle, figuring it all out. So if you don't like puzzles, then you probably don't want to go into codes. That's how I think of it as, it's kind of a big puzzle that you have to figure out. So that is the index. So the first, I don't say half of the book because it's not even the first half, but the first portion of the book are the different indexes. And then once we get into these fun little colored tabs that say chapter on them, that is what they refer to as the tabular list or the tabular list of diseases and injuries. It is divided up by chapter based on body system or by condition. So the first exercise that you guys are going to do, that is exercise, forgot the number of that, 2-1, is actually going to have you determine is this chapter organized by body system or by the condition, cause of disease. So you'll have to look at the name of the chapter and determine if it is chapter 9, disease of the circulatory system, is that by body system or is that by disease? Like I say, circulatory system.
Body system.
Body system, yeah. So that first one is just to kind of get your mind thinking in these terms. Is this a body system or is this a disease? The tabular, again, this is where you're going to find your actual codes, where you're going to look up the specifics of each. Codes can be anywhere between 3 and 7 characters within the ICD-10-CM code guidelines, anywhere between 3 and 7. So it just depends on the specifics of that area if it is going to be a full code or not. I'll come back to that one. And again, we're going to talk about some of these specifics that include, exclude, see, all that sort of thing. But they're going to determine, the notes that we'll talk about next week are going to determine if your code is fully coded, if it's coded out all the way, or 3 codes is all it needs. So again, within the tabular, the main code is going to be in, it's going to be bolded. So if we just go to some random, let's go to chapter, let's go to chapter 19. If you can, injuries to the neck. So let's, if you have a book, it's going to be somewhere around 974. Switch to that page. And then if you are in the PDF file, you're going to go to the tabular. So again, Port Resources, Codes, Tabular. Let me open this up. Oh. so I can have those that are at home. This will make a little more sense. Tabular. So if we go to page 26, I wonder how close these are. Not even close, okay. I want to go to chapter 19. Injuries to the neck. Okay. Chapter 19, injuries to the neck. That's 12, is what I was trying to look for. Okay, so if you're on the PDF, go to 1, 2, 3, 4. That would have been easier. I knew that up front. So if you're on the PDF, page 1, 2, 3, 4. Just so you can kind of look at, follow along as I'm. So on this, in the tabular, your main topic headings are going to be printed. It says in bold uppercase letters, but mine aren't in uppercase. Are yours in uppercase? So the book lied on that, but they are bold because all of mine are bold. So all of your main topics, your main headings in your tabular are going to be in bold letters, and then there's going to be a 3-character category that's associated with that. So if we are looking at S12, you guys see where it says maybe S12? What does it say next to S12? What would be that major topic heading?
I think that's what it
Fracture,
means.
cervical, vertebra, and other parts of the neck.
Yeah. So that's your main topic. So again, if you were, yep,
What page, in the book, 900?
976.
Mine's 963.
Yeah, so they're all gonna be a little bit different. And it does depend on the verb, but, so we have kind of an idea. So that's your main topic. All of your codes, the first character in all of your codes is always going to be a letter. And the letters are going to be broken down kind of by chapters. For the most part, it is pretty consistent by chapters, but some letters cover more than one chapter. So this is a list of all of the chapters that are in the tabular, and the names of those chapters, as well as the range of codes that are in those chapters. So see, chapter 1 is A and B. So if it's an A and B code, and again, as you get used to this, you're going to recognize these things. You're going to get to where you remember, like, oh, this is an accident to the, you got into a car accident, or it happened at a barn or something, and you're like, oh, that's probably going to be down here in my Z codes or my V code or something like that. So you'll kind of start getting the idea. Over the next several weeks, once we start getting into each of these chapters, we're gonna have a lecture on each of these chapters and talk about the specifics of each of them. Some are pretty simple when you get through them. There's not a whole lot of rules and regulations that go along with it, different guidelines that you have to follow. Some are very complex. So some of the chapters we'll be able to get through pretty quickly, and some will be a little bit slower as we go through it. But I just kind of wanted you to see. So you see the category. If that's all it says, if the medical document just says like fracture of the cervical vertebrae and other parts of the neck, doesn't really say anything else, that is fully coded out. But if it is including more information, then you have to continue the process. That was one of the things we talked about the first day where you're undercoding things, is you're not reading the full description and including everything that goes along with that. So if you saw a record and you just pull out diabetes with complications, but it actually said type 1 and you didn't pull that, then you did not fully code that, and the code's not going to be listed correctly. So the big thing, and again, this will make more sense once we get into the specific chapters, but just know it can be anywhere between 3 and 7 characters, and a X can be used as a placeholder. So if we're still looking at that S12, I want you to kind of scroll down a little bit. Look for S12.000. Where did I have this? Oh, weird. So I just noticed this, that I'm telling you to look at the PDF. What does it, if you have a book, what does it show next to that?
The
Additional code required.
Does it say plus 7th character? Yeah, it doesn't show that on the PDF. Might be a little harder to use the PDF, because it doesn't give you all the notes, it looks like. Let me see if I can find one that has all the notes on here. Either that or they're just listed in a different area. Because then also, if you have the book, if you go down to S12.01.
Well, it says up above there, the appropriate 7th character.
Should be added. So, okay, we'll just have to look, I'll point that out whenever we get into each of the chapters where you'll see that on the, because the book, it's a lot easier to look at with the book. If you haven't seen it in the book, you're welcome to look at mine. It has it nice and color coded, and there's this big right next to it that says plus 7th character to notify you that, hey, this one needs a 7th character. And then the other one says X plus 7th character, meaning that there's not actually a 6th character, but it needs a 7th character, so you use an X as a placeholder. So the book does give a little bit more detail on that than the PDF file does. I'll see if I can find a PDF file that has a little bit more detail, and I'll upload those for when we get to that, just to make it a little bit easier. Or we can all requested more books. Maybe we'll have enough books for everybody in here by that point. But if it asks for a 7th character and you do not put a 7th character, then it is not coded correctly. If it asks for a 7th character and there's not a 6th character and you don't put X plus the 7th character, then it's not coded correctly. So if you were to put 612.01A, because you're saying it was an initial a counter, that's not correct. That A should actually be in the 7th spot. Again, we'll talk specifics when we get to each chapter, but just to know, it can be up to 7 characters, and X's are can be used as placeholders if there's not enough characters in that specific code. I talked about this a little bit, but again, I'm going to go do a whole chapter over this. But kind of the basic steps for coding, again, just to say it about 50 times, is you do have to review that patient record, and you can't document something that's not in the patient record, and you need to pay attention to what the main terms are in that record. You're going to follow the instructional terms. We're going to talk Thursday about some of these instructional terms when it says maybe see also, or you may have saw on that PDF. Code first, little notes like that. Note includes little things like that. What does that mean? We're going to talk about that on Thursday because you're going to see that throughout the different chapters, so you know that ahead. Again, when we get into each of the chapters, I'll talk and remind you, what does this mean? When the condition is not easily found in the index, a lot of times it may be because you're looking at the wrong main term, or the main term may actually have you go to, a different type of disease. So the book actually provided these terms. So if you were to look at this from the main term, if you were to look up pregnancy, there's going to be a lot under that one. Maybe that's not the actual main term that you need to look for, and it'll give you different notes to make sure that you're directed into the right place. You always do want to start with the index, so we're going to practice this every time. As you're going through the class assignment, yeah, it might be easy if there's 4 multiple choice items to choose from. You could go to those multiple choice items and pick which one's the correct one, but that's not going to help you in the long run if you're actually going to want to code. You need to know the process of doing it, because you're not going to get a multiple choice option when you're out there trying to figure it out. Unfortunately, it's not always going to be there. So So it's important to go through the steps correctly. So if you just want to verify yourself, if you, like, I look it up correctly and you want to then go back and look, we'll talk about some tips to do that. But you do always want to start with the index and then verify in the tabular. So even if there is a code, when you've looked in the index, when we talked about like these codes that are next to diabetes or complications in type 1, you still want to double check in the tabular to make sure that you do not need to add, there's not any additional notes in there. There's not something that you're supposed to be including or coding first or coding additionally. So you do want to always verify that information within the tabular and not just code directly from the index. This link, because I talked about the updates, this actually will link you to the updates that you need. So based on whatever book that you have, like I said, I think mine that I have, the examples that I have, or the ones that I passed around are 2017. So then you can go to the 2017, this would be that book. So you'd want to go to the new guidelines. Our book, the 2020 just came out. Everything that is for this book is actually from the 19. And the book, the tables that I provided, the information that I provided is actually from 19. So I probably, when we're referencing it, I'd probably go to 19 for the book purposes. In the real world, you'll always want to go to the most recent one. But I linked that on there and we'll use that later on. Oops. Any questions? I need to work on talking faster or not including more information than what is in this chapter. I get ahead of myself. So, let's see. Now I have to stop recording. Nobody has questions right now, right, for the recording?